Welcome to another deep dive. You sent us this chapter 4, and it's really about, well-being, and kind of what we're hoping to really get into is, what does it say about, the role of our thoughts in all this? What mental shifts do we need to make? What ways of thinking are really important?
Yeah. So, I think when we look at this chapter, it's interesting because the approach is different from what you might think. You might think, okay, well-being, maybe we're going to dive into, all the physiology and all that. But right away, it goes in a different direction, really emphasizing, the mind and the power of our thoughts as being so foundational. And the real core here is, instead of being so focused on disease, it's like actively cultivating this idea of health in your mind, making that the foundation.
Right. And it's not just about ignoring the possibility of getting sick or anything like that. It uses this interesting idea of a vacant house, if you just try to push out the negative thoughts without really putting something else in its place, it's just going to come right back. So it's more about, building up this sense of health, this well-being.
Yeah, and it's not passive, right? That's what's so fascinating here. It's this idea of the assumption and appropriation of health.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just, it's not like you're passively avoiding disease, you're actively choosing to embrace health.
So how do we actually make that happen? It talks about forming, this mental image of ourselves as being perfectly healthy and strong, but that's tough. What if you've never really experienced that, that ideal level of health?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, and the chapter acknowledges this. And that's where it brings in this really important idea of forming a conception of perfect health.
Yeah.
And it argues that this is even more important than having, a specific visual image in your mind.
Okay. So it's less about a crystal clear picture of the perfect body and more about something else. So what exactly is this conception?
I think it's more of a deep understanding.
Yeah.
Deep understanding of what it would be like for every single part of your body to be functioning perfectly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be visual. It's more like a comprehension of what optimal functioning feels like.
Okay. So it's knowing on an intuitive level, what peak performance feels like, even if we haven't always been there. So how do we get there? How do we actually cultivate this? It seems a lot more abstract than, say, visualizing a relaxing scene or something like that.
Well, some practical advice here. One of the things it says is just to constantly think of yourself doing everything in the manner of a perfectly strong and healthy person.
I like that. So, rather than thinking, oh, this is going to be hard, or, before you even start something, you're already feeling tired. It's no, imagine yourself moving freely and easily.
Exactly. Picture yourself, standing tall, walking with energy. Imagine going through your day, not with that sense of fatigue, but with that, that surplus of energy.
So it's almost like embodying the idea of health, even if, visually it's not perfect in your mind.
Right. And the chapter makes this point, don't think about how weak people do things. Think about how strong people do things. That's a really subtle but important distinction.
So even when we're observing other people, maybe, struggling with things or whatever, we're actively trying to not dwell on those images, but really bring our focus back to this ideal, this conception of health.
Yeah. And so then the chapter goes on to talk about this thing called the principle of health.
Okay, the principle of health. So what's that all about?
Well, it basically says that inside each of us, there's this principle that's in control of all those involuntary functions, like your digestion, your circulation, all the things that your body does without you having to, consciously think about it. It's like your body's built-in self-regulation system, and it's very receptive to your thoughts.
So there's one central principle that orchestrates all of that. Interesting way to think about it.
Yeah. And so, the idea is that if you can impress upon this principle, this thought of perfect health, that's going to influence all those parts, all the different organs in your body.
It's almost like, you've got the central operating system. And if you can keep telling it, hey, we're healthy, we're strong, that's the signal that gets sent out to every part of the system.
Exactly. And, that this challenges the idea that you need, a separate principle for each organ, you don't need a liver principle and a stomach principle. It's one unified thing. Now, here's where things get really interesting. The chapter then kind of takes this unexpected stance on something that we often associate with, understanding health, which is physiology.
Yeah, it actually cautions against getting too, caught up in studying how the body works, at least in in a super detailed way. So why is that?
Well, it gives a couple of reasons. The first one is that, our current physiological knowledge is still imperfect. So it argues that, since our knowledge is imperfect, our thoughts that are based on that knowledge are also going to be imperfect. And as we've already talked about, those imperfect thoughts can, according to this chapter, lead to imperfect functioning, which can, manifest as disease.
That's a little bit counterintuitive, though, right? I mean, you would think that, the more we understand about our bodies, the better off we'd be.
And it uses an example. It talks about how, there used to be this belief that a human being could only survive for a very short amount of time without food. And this was based on, what was considered to be scientific fact at the time.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. It was a matter of days, right?
Exactly. And the chapter suggests that, this belief, which was so widespread and, backed by science, actually caused people to die, within that time frame because they believed that's all they could survive. It's like their belief became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. It really is a powerful example of how, our beliefs can actually shape our physical reality.
Totally. And so then, the chapter goes on to talk about examples like Dr. Tanner, who fasted for an extended period of time, and Dr. Dewey and others who, they fasted for way longer than what science said was possible.
Yeah.
And these examples just go to show that, what we think is fact, from a scientific perspective, may not actually be, the whole truth.
So what it's saying is that, flawed scientific knowledge can lead to these limiting beliefs, and those beliefs can actually be harmful.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it says very explicitly that, erroneous physiology can work very mischievous results. It's basically saying that, it can create these mental barriers that prevent us from reaching our full potential for health. And then it goes on to make this point, it says that we don't actually need a deep understanding of physiology to think perfect health or to perform our voluntary actions in a healthy way.
So we don't need to be experts in, cellular biology or whatever in order to have this right mindset.
That's what it's saying. It's suggesting that, getting lost in all those details may not be the most effective way to cultivate this thought of perfect health. And it actually extends this caution to hygiene as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It has some similar reservations about, focusing too much on hygiene. And I think the argument is that, those fields tend to focus on what's wrong, on the germs and the potential threats.
Right. And so, by constantly engaging with that information, about what can go wrong, maybe we're inadvertently focusing our thoughts in the wrong direction. It's kind of counterproductive to this idea of, cultivating a conception of perfect health. If your goal is to think only health, then, maybe constantly thinking about disease isn't the best approach.
So we're moving away from, detailed medical study, and we're moving more towards this idea of actively cultivating this conception of health. What are the practical steps that it suggests we take?
The first step, it says, is to drop all investigation into your present condition, its cause, and what it might lead to. I'm sure that's a welcome suggestion for anyone who, tends to ruminate about their health, getting caught up in all the what ifs.
Right, like stop analyzing every ache and pain, every little symptom. So what should we be focusing on instead?
Well, the focus now shifts entirely to forming this conception of health that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And it encourages you to, to think about the possibilities of perfect health. Think about how great it would feel, to be perfectly well, and what you would be able to do, if you had that energy and vitality.
It's like, really creating a compelling mental vision of a healthy life.
Exactly. And then it says that you need to make this conception the constant guide in your thinking about yourself. Anything that's not in harmony with that, this perfect ideal of health, you got to reject it.
So it's almost like having this mental filter, right? Like anything that doesn't support this idea of well-being just gets blocked out.
Yeah. And it says, any thought of disease or imperfect functioning, cast it out instantly and replace it with a thought that's aligned with your conception of health.
That takes a lot of mental discipline.
It does. But the chapter really emphasizes how important it is. So then, it goes into this interesting idea of, this thing called intelligent substance.
Intelligent substance. Okay, now we're getting into some kind of deep, maybe a little abstract territory here. So what's this all about?
Well, it describes it as this, original substance that permeates and fills all the tissues of your body. And the key here is that it says this substance takes form according to your thought. It's like the underlying intelligence of your body, and it's always working to maintain equilibrium, but it's highly influenced by your mental state.
So our thoughts aren't just like these abstract things happening in our heads. They actually have a real impact on our physical being.
That's what it's suggesting. It calls it intelligent substance, or sometimes even mind stuff. And it says that this stuff is what controls the functions of your body.
Okay, so if we're constantly thinking about health, what's the effect of that on this mind stuff?
Well, it says that, if you're holding thoughts of perfectly healthy function, it's going to cause movements in this substance. And ultimately, that can lead to, the rebuilding of healthy cells throughout your body.
It's a pretty remarkable idea that our mental state can have such a direct influence on our physical cells.
Yeah, and it ties in with this whole idea of the mind-body connection, right? And so it introduces this concept of a mind-body, which is formed of this intelligent substance. And this mind-body is what actually controls the physical body.
So our conscious thoughts about our health, whether they're positive or negative, are kind of imprinting themselves on this mind body.
That's what it's saying. And it says that thoughts of disease can actually impress themselves upon this mind stuff, and that can, potentially lead to physical ailments. It even hints that these negative impressions could come from, our own past thinking, or even from our parents.
So, like, inherited thought patterns could actually be influencing our health. That's pretty wild.
Yeah. But then it also makes this point that the natural tendency of the mind itself is toward health. It's our negative thought patterns that are disrupting this natural tendency.
So it's like by focusing on thoughts of health, we're actually aligning ourselves with this inherent drive of our mind body toward well-being.
Yeah, exactly. And it says that this focusing of the mind on health will lead to, to healthy function. But then it makes this point, that the transformation of the physical body isn't instantaneous.
Right. It's a process, isn't it?
Yeah. It happens cell by cell along established lines of growth. But, it's this thought of health that's guiding it all. It's like you're providing the blueprint for a healthier version of ourselves through our thoughts.
Yeah. And so to really drive these points home, it gives us a summary of these key ideas in the form of a syllabus.
Yeah, that's right. So, let's go over those key takeaways. What are the absolute core ideas that it wants us to remember?
Well, the first one is this idea that there's this permeating thinking substance that's like the fundamental life of everything.
Right. And that thought, in this substance is what creates form and motion. And in relation to man, it's always aiming for perfect health. It's like the universe is inherently supportive of our well-being.
Yeah, it does seem to be suggesting that. The second point is that, man's thought has power over his functioning. And so imperfect thoughts, negative thoughts, they can cause a kind of perversion of that natural function.
Right. And then it says, thinking only perfect health will activate this power of life within us. But, we also need to act in accordance with that, with healthy, voluntary functions.
So it's not enough to just think healthy thoughts. We also have to, actually take care of ourselves in practical ways.
Right. It's not a magic bullet. And then it boils it all down to these two crucial steps, right? Learning to think perfect health and learning to eat, drink, breathe, and sleep in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Those are the two essentials.
So it's like this two-pronged approach, taking care of our minds and taking care of our bodies. And they both work together.
Exactly. And this chapter, really sets the stage for the mental side of things. I mean, it's a powerful argument for how influential our thoughts are in shaping our health.
So to kind of bring this deep dive to a close, I think, the key message here is that our thoughts about health aren't just, passive reflections. They're really a fundamental force in creating our reality. And so this idea of cultivating this conception of perfect health, that's like a really powerful first step.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, how this chapter kind of moves away from that traditional medical approach, where we're so focused on disease and all the details of physiology. It's really about shifting our mental energy toward this idea of vibrant health.
Which makes me think, how much time do we spend, maybe without even realizing it, focusing on, what might be wrong or things that happened in the past or being afraid of getting sick instead of really embracing this possibility of being perfectly well.
Right. And that leads us to this question for you, the listener. How might cultivating this conception of health, how might aligning your thoughts with it, how might that change your daily experience?
That's a great question. Something to really think about. And, if you're now curious about the other side of things, the eating, drinking, breathing, sleeping, the chapter definitely encourages you to explore the rest of this source. There's clearly a lot more to learn. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.